I want to talk about the West. One of the most embarrassing moments of my life was when I was farming. I went back to academia, and I had to give a lecture. First lecture I ever gave was on the West, and I just assumed people thought it was Western civilization. Cal State Fresno at that time had one of the biggest ag departments in any public university, and just when I started, about 50 people came in with cowboy hats and boots. I started speaking. They all walked out en masse, and they thought it was going to be on high noon in the history of the Western, because they'd never heard that term. And it's a term we don't use very much anymore. The West. Europeans don't like to use it. After the ascension of George Bush, nobody wants to see America monolithic with anybody or allied. And we're told it's a clash of civilizations to delineate. But there is a West. It's a nation, or it's a realm of ideas. And I think you all know them, even if you might be hard-pressed if you were quizzed upon these values. It's an insidious culture that in it from the very beginning it was able to transcend local, regional, ethnic, racial identifications. That's why today, for example, any of us could probably go to China and find that we would never be fully accepted as Chinese citizens, whereas people from China can be accepted in the West as full-blooded citizens, full-fledged citizens. That's why today Japan is more Western than Bulgaria in some sense, because it's a realm of the mind. And that realm consists of everything from consensual or constitutional government. Sometimes we call it democracy. It can be, Aristotle said you can go from democracy all the way to narrow-based oligarchy as long as it was constitutional in some way elected. We tend to privilege private property and the protection of a legal system that allows capital to be gained, hoarded, whatever your take on that is. Capitalism. There's a chauvinism of the middle class. There's less likelihood there's going to be a pyramidal society with a few elites on top and everybody else on the bottom, as we see in the Near East. The Greeks were very aware of that when they talked about the hoi mesoi, or as they used it in the abstract, the ta messe, the middle things, middle people. They didn't exist in other cultures or civilizations, at least those that they knew in the Mediterranean. We also tend to talk about freedom, freedom of expression, freedom of worship, freedom of speech. We talk about civilian control of institutions, and I mean that in the broadest secular sense. Religion, it has a role to play, a domain, but it does not dominate science and reason. I know some of you think we in America have forgotten that, but it's not quite true. We still believe in the triumph of reason. We still worship Logos. Now, I'm not suggesting that Western culture in 800 AD or 400 BC embraced all of these values in their full and mature form. The key is, remember, there was a greater likelihood in the West to have a secular government than in Egypt, a greater likelihood that you could have a system of interest and investment than there was in the Muslim world in 1800. A greater likelihood that the Roman Republic would have voting in the way that my ancestors up in Scandinavia wouldn't. And that's important to think, because too often we look back at the West and we find that because it's not perfect, it's not good. And that's something that only the modern mind has seemed to develop, that utopian perfectionism, that it has to be everything fully developed without prejudice, without bias, without illiberality, or we reject the whole entirely. But if we were to go back from the present, we can see the West in our founding fathers and their influence in the Scottish and French Enlightenment and British Enlightenment. We can trace its roots in the Renaissance, the Reformation. We can go back even to the Swiss Republic in the Middle Ages. And there was, even for the Empire of Rome, that period between 31 BC and, say, 476, there were still local consuls. And much of Rome still worked, besides the autocratic central government, as it had in the Republic. And the Republic itself was influenced by classical Greece. And we can go back until the early city-state, and then it stops. We don't find what we call the West before the 8th century BC. I know that the Mycenaean Greeks were Greek speakers. They had the same word for olive tree that their ancestors did. They lived in the same place. They had the same climate, but they were not Westerners. They were a palatial people who were in some ways antithetical to what followed. In the same way that the Greeks were not necessarily a Mediterranean people. They were, of course, geographically, agriculturally, economically in some sense, but they were anti-Mediterranean in their mentality. Almost all of their institutions were not only unique, but they were at odds with the prevailing status quo in Persia, in Egypt, and in Eastern Europe, and in the North African regions. So, one of the things that we learned from the Greeks at the very beginning of this Western paradigm is that when this menu was applied to the battlefield, funny things happened. It turned out that if you had a greater degree of consensuality, of the profit motive, you kept religion out of science and government, you championed individual expression, when that menu was applied to the battlefield, the Greeks, the Romans, and those who embraced that paradigm exercised military power that was not explicable by the relatively small population of Europe and the small territory of Europe. I don't think this was, as Jared Diamond has explained, based on guns, germs, and steel, because after all, Mycenaean Greece did not control the Mediterranean. It had the same resources that the Polis Greeks had. We could go into Egypt in the 9th or 10th century BC and say that this civilization would be tottering because of salinization and overuse of resources in the Nile Delta. And we could fast forward 7 centuries under the Ptolemaic Alexandrians, we could see this boom where grain production had not only recovered, but exceeded anything the pharaohs had been able to produce. So in some ways, this Western paradigm was not just immune to the natural world around it, the natural world was almost irrelevant to it. Flying into Calgary, you go over the Alps and you see the climate, it looks pretty barren. And then you see the city rising out. Most places in the world, people who were given these resources would think that they're not at all hospitable. And yet this paradigm is allowing them to be exploited in a way that produces vast amounts of capital. When this was applied to the battlefield, it starts to explain things why in the southeastern Balkans, Greece is only 50,000 square miles, about 1 million people to 2 million people in antiquity. It exercises military power through much of the Mediterranean. And when Alexander the Great hijacks this, I say that hijack because there is a tendency, whether it's Alexander, Napoleon, or Hitler, to look at certain aspects of the West, especially the technological aspects, the scientific aspects, the aspects of discipline, hijacks these, and then does not really want to embrace consensuality or freedom of the individual. But when Alexander hijacks that, he ends up with 50,000 soldiers on the Indus River. It seems to me that within a century, you could say that Rome went from 1/4 to 1/3 of the Italian peninsula with just 4 or 5 million Italians to an empire that comprised over 1 million square miles. I'm not saying there has not been inroads into this rather small area of Europeanization. Who couldn't admit that with Hannibal or Xerxes or the Moguls or the Ottoman Turks at the gates of Vienna for a winter. But by and large, the story of Western civilization is the story of people applying military power either to convert or to conquer or to exploit far beyond the realm of Europe. It's not a moral question, at least this afternoon I don't want to pose it as such. I'm not interested in whether they should or should not, but why they had the ability to do that and others didn't. Why the Crusades, we talk about Saladin, but why didn't Saladin just simply take some ships and sail up the Thames River? Or why was Cortez in Tenochtitlan and Montezuma was not in Barcelona? Or why did Xerxes fail at Salamis in a way that Alexander, with far fewer troops, found that he was quite successful in central Anatolia and all the way into what is today the Punjab? These are questions that don't really have a lot to do with morality. I'm happy to address if you have those questions, but for now, it's one of efficacy and dynamism. Dynamism being a morally neutral term in this sense. So what was it about Western civilization that allowed people to kill others like no other? The first thing is technology, obviously. What Westerners lacked in small numbers, and they're usually away from home, they could make up with force multipliers with tools of killing. And you apply the Western paradigm of science and reason without interference from government or religion, and you marry that with the profit motive, and it's more or less true that all weapons discoveries in the history of civilization are mostly a Western phenomenon. Now note that I don't mean that the West has a monopoly on human genius. There's no genetic, no racial component to this. What the West does do is steal, borrow, adopt things from other cultures in a way that they had never been dreamed of there. So gunpowder, which is largely confined to a Mandarin class, and there might be wood or leather guns, when it's stolen or borrowed, however we want to term it, by Westerners, then suddenly every single development in the history of gunpowder and fiery weapons are Western, whether we look at flints or percussions or corn gunpowder or rifle barrels or automatic breeches. Why is that? Because in the West, people could say what they wanted, argue with each other, and make money on that invention or that development or that exploitation to a greater degree than you could in China. And that explains why Greek bronze plate was superior to the alternative. Herodotus, some of you have seen the 300. I know that the bare nude torsos are pretty much of a convention of Frank Miller and Zack Snyder, the director and the writer, but pretty much the Greeks, when they did wear their breastplates, they were of superior quality. When the Venetians at the Battle of Lepanto defeated the Ottomans, they rounded up over 600 precious bronze guns, and they found they had to melt them down because the level of metallurgy was not up to Venetian standards, and they felt that the metal was more valuable just as a raw product than it was a finished Ottoman cannon. And I could enumerate those examples, but I think you would all agree that almost everything that's killing Americans in Iraq today, whether it's the IED or the suicide belt or what have you, is in some ways taken from a Western design or a Western manufacturer or manufactured in Iran on Western auspices and guidelines and blueprints. If Mr. Ahmadinejad gets his nuclear weapon, it will be because either North Korean or Pakistani or Soviet technology gave it to him, and that technology in its ultimate source, if we could have the time, we could find its way back to German or European or American or British physics, which themselves are based on a longer tradition that goes back well beyond the Renaissance to the Greeks in some sense. So technology and capitalism. I can't stress that too much. When Hernan Cortez in 1521 was fighting the Aztecs, remember that butcher with just 1,600 conquistadores and hidalgos destroyed an empire of 4 million in less than 2 years. One of the ways he did it wasn't just that he had Toledo Spanish steel, that helped. It wasn't just that he had bronze cannon gunpowder, that helped. Remember, right outside the walls at Tenochtitlan, all the ingredients for gunpowder were there: saltpeter, carbon, everything was there, and the Aztecs had no clue about it. He created gunpowder and fabricated it right where he was, as well as bronze. There was tin and copper right there that nobody had seen before. But the real key to that success is that he sent out contracts throughout the Spanish domain, and people lined up in galleons at Veracruz to supply him with nails, with wood, with mast, with firearms, with arquebuses, with plate armor, with horses. Why? Because they liked him? Because they were Spanish? No. Because there was money to be made, and there was a sophisticated economy that worked. Third thing that Western armies have always found, besides their propensity to use technology and capitalism, is that they had redefined discipline. Aristotle in his Politics has a fine little treatise about why the Greeks of the city-state don't count how many people they kill. They don't collect heads, they don't collect souvenirs. And the Aristeon, the award for valor, is very rarely awarded to individual prowess. In fact, people at the Battle of Plataea or Thermopylae or Salamis who go out beyond the battle line don't necessarily gain recognition for that fact of individual prowess. They're often punished for it. Rather, the West has been able to redefine bravery as staying in rank, marching in time, advancing on order, retreating, saving the man to the left or the right. That's what the phalanx, the legion, and when you enter the realm of fiery weapons, mass-produced in the 15th century, these can be easily transferred to people in South America, and they were, to the Zulus, and they were in the 19th century. But the idea of firing on cue, firing according to order, calibrating your weapons, staying in rank, that's very hard to teach. I'm reminded here of the battle at Rorke's Drift, where the Zulus actually had the day before stormed the British at Isla Wanda and come upon over 600 of the best weapons in the world, Martini Henry rifle, that could kill a man easily at 1,500 yards. But they did not have any training on how to fire those in unison. If you knew how to fire them in unison, you could put a shell, and they were single-shot breech loaders. You could put a shot in, have one line shoot while the one behind it was reloading, while the one behind it was reloading, and keep up a steady stream of fire at about every 15 to 20 seconds. And then you could have men before the battle go out and hammer stakes in the ground every 100 yards because people had been taught what the drop was on that 50 caliber shell every 100 yards, quarter-inch, half-inch, 1-inch, and they were able to sight on those stakes. And the people, there were 17 Victoria Crosses awarded at Rorke's Drift. Not one of them would be awarded for things that the Zulus would have highly prized. That would be soldiers who ran out of the stockade and hand-to-hand fought a Zulu hero. No, it was all for going into a hospital and saving somebody who was wounded, going out beyond the line to get a water pail to bring back for people, dragging people in from the battlefield, offering to lend your weapon to somebody that was in need of another weapon. So there was this idea of group solidarity that redefined what it was to be a heroic on the battlefield. And that tended to help Western armies in a way that is otherwise inexplicable, as I said, by their relatively small populations and territory. There's another thing, too, that we often forget, and that's this hotly debated, hotly contested fine line between civilian and military control. But in the West, there's a greater propensity for civilians to be intimately involved in the decision-making process of going to war. I can't think of a single Greek general, maybe some of you can, who at one time was not fined, ostracized, exiled, or executed, or had his property confiscated. All the great minds, Pericles, Themistocles, the Spartan Lysander, the great liberator Epaminondas, they all either were on trial or had to flee. And it shows you the level of civilian control over the military. I remarked this latest revolt of the generals we had, where a number of retired 2- and 3-star generals revolted at their anger, and they went to the press and said that Mr. Rumsfeld was incompetent. And people were sort of uneasy about that. But that Mr. Rumsfeld himself was a reaction. Remember, Mr. Rumsfeld was trying to put generals in their place, and people said, well, you know, the civilians are kind of micromanaging the war. He's been reading Supreme Command by Elliot Cohen. He believes too much that generals shouldn't, you know, direct military affairs. But that was a reaction to the 1990s when Colin Powell wrote an op-ed basically telling people in the military to vote for George Bush, and basically telling Bill Clinton, we're not going to have gays in the military. Forget it. That was not his decision. But it shows you how we have this uneasy yin and yang, and it shows you how military affairs are governed by civilians. Whatever your view is on Iraq, you could make the argument that the Abizaid-Rumsfeld-Casey strategy was not working as well, and Mr. Petraeus coming in with a surge and new rules of engagement. Why did he come here? What was the change? The change was civilian pressure, both in the Congress and the public. And that, in the long run, I know we think of Vietnam, in the long run, that tends to favor military operations, the efficacy. The more people you can bring into the equation with a greater wealth of experience. And it's not just civilians running it, it's not just military people. There's this odd and very unique blend of the two in Western societies that turns out to be very valuable. But increased discipline, civilians involved in the process, superior technology, the incorporation of capitalist modes of production for logistical purposes. There's also another one, and I think that is a greater propensity for soldiers to believe they're free or that they have latitudes of freedom that their opponents do not. I'm not suggesting that the Soviet army of the Wehrmacht was at all emblematic of Westerns, but over centuries, by and large, there was a notion that Westerners fought for a consensual society and they were not going to be whipped as the Persians were at the Pass of Thermopylae. That scene out of the 300 actually came right out of the pages of Herodotus. Free men. Remember the Spartan Demaratus, the renegade Spartan king tells King Xerxes, there's one thing these people fight for, and it's called nomos, law, the law that they have crafted. One of the strangest things is I was researching the names of Greek triremes. Now, I might expect freedom, eleutheria, but free speech, and not just one word, two, parisia and eleutheria. A lot of different ideas, and people act. Can you imagine a USS free speech? Maybe you can, but that's what the Athenians actually called their triremes in some cases. I don't think any Persian vessel would dare have that name on it. And that's been true throughout the West. This idea that individuals feel that they have a stake in the conduct of military operations. We don't have a draft today. We're not really classically adhering to the notion of civic militarism. But believe me, the individual person in the professional army of the United States has more rights and responsibilities under the military uniform code of military justice than does a draftee in the army of North Korea or Iran. And that goes way back to the Greeks. Has this always led in military superiority? I would argue that except for these brief periods, yes, in the conventional sense. But it doesn't mean that at times there hasn't been ways to check this juggernaut. I mean, there's places, whether it's the Little Bighorn or Isla Wanda or the Noche Triste of Cortez, where we have seen, or the Ottomans in North Africa, or the Siege of Cyprus, where numbers or the stupid generals or bad days or too far from home or bad weather trump the West. And all I'm suggesting is that all things being equal, the West had a greater propensity to trump individual genius like a Hannibal or tropical diseases in Mexico City or great distances like South Africa. But there were times when the non-West had figured ways out to finally stop this. And I think you know them today. The first, of course, is what we call asymmetrical warfare. And that is to redefine what is losses and what's victory, what's defeat. When Cortez goes into Mexico City with 1,600 men, and these are all hidalgos, men of property and substance in Castile, and they have on their backs 2 years' salary of Spanish steel, and they have an arquebus and a horse, some of them, then you can't afford to lose very many of them. And when one is lost, this invading force feels that singular loss of a conquistador, 600 on the Noche Triste, are more deleterious to their overall efficacy at arms than the Aztecs do if they lose 1,000 warriors. It's nothing to do with morality or relative sensitivity over the loss of human life, but just simply that Westerners, A, are usually far from home in smaller numbers, but more importantly, they come from a society where the combination of consensuality and capitalism often gives it a higher standard of living. Life is very good. It's not easy to lose. If you're in the Anbar province today and you're one of 12 children and the per capita salary of your father is on average maybe $1,200, and you can run out and you can take an RPG and shoot down a $2 million Apache, and with it a Army major with a bachelor's degree from West Point with $250,000 of capital invested in that education, and 3 kids in a suburban home and a pretty good life ahead of him, then if that helicopter falls on you, in relative terms, your loss is not going to affect the morale of the insurgency as much as that Army major's will. And that's been true throughout antiquity as well. When the Macedonians, who only had 50,000, went into Persia and then to India, one of the revolts of the soldiers was not just they were far from home, but they felt they were losing too many. Well, losing too many in comparison to the Persians would be a joke. But they didn't have that many to lose, and life in Macedon in some cases was much better for the average Macedonian than the average Afghan or Mede or Babylonian or Lydian or Indian or Persian. And so when the West goes and fights, it has to be very careful because it has a limited amount of people it can lose. Second, of course, is if you want to check this juggernaut, you can turn the West against each other. Some people have asked, why were the Ottomans so successful between the 15th and 18th centuries, making inroads into the Mediterranean world? Because they were parasitic on Western weapons. Most of the renegade Ottoman admirals that were themselves Italian, most of the foreigners most of the people who ran the economy in Istanbul were not Ottoman themselves. They didn't have a national bank till the 19th century. And the answer to that was Europe was not uniform. If you look at the Battle of Lepanto, for example, it's not just that the Florentines and the Venetians and the Genovese and the Spaniards are at each other's throat literally minutes before the battle, but that the Ottoman fleet has habitually wintered, no surprise here, in Toulon and the harbors of France. France, England are cutting deals with the Ottomans, and Europe itself is trisected into Orthodoxy, Catholicism, and Protestantism. And any foe who can manipulate those differences can be quite successful. There were probably, we don't know the exact number, but probably less than 10,000 people killed in the wars of the American frontier. 600,000 died in the Civil War. And if you look back at Western history, there was a brief respite for about 5 to 6 years where Americans were not so lethal or not so aggressive or adventurous on the frontier when they had a war to their rear. It seems to me that the South and North killed far more and did far more for the cause of Native American rights than Native American warriors ever did. And that's always been true. More people were lost in the first 2 hours of the Battle of the Somme than in 100 years of colonial British adventurism all over the globe. In other words, German machine guns, gas, and shells killed more British people than all the Zulus and all the Africans and all the Indians put together. Why is that? Because when this tradition is turned on itself, it's absolutely lethal. Not just in the military sense, but in the diplomatic as well. If you're an Iraqi insurgent and you really want to call off this American military machine, you can redefine the rules, as we said, by being asymmetrical. But you can also hope that you can get Western nations and the United Nations to not sanctify this war, sanction this war, as they did. Or maybe you can get Britain to get out of the coalition. Or maybe you can have Spain fight with the United States by blowing up people in Spain. And this has been always true, that the West was never monolithic in its perception of itself. A third is that because Western nations are consensual, they require a majority of the population to wage war. I'm not saying they're always fully democratic, but because they're consensual, there's a freedom of expression. People's views do matter. If you want to call off Cortez, they almost did it. Not that they were active, the Aztecs, but Father Sehugun was shocked at the treatment of indigenous Native Americans, and he was filing writ after writ with the Spanish king. He was also, others were arguing that Cortez had done something illegal, and so when he went back to see Narvaez at Veracruz, he was almost arrested. What's almost stopped the British Army in 1879 and the so-called Zulu Wars was not Zulu martial prowess, although they were the most effective, bravest warriors on the African continent, it was people like the Colenso family, Bishop Colenso, who was writing the Queen fervently to stop this war, which was amoral and did not reflect the values of the British public in its liberal Victorian face. And the same was true of the Boer War, very unpopular war, and that was almost cut off until the intervention of Lord Kitchener and the radical change in tactics. And you can see that whether we look at the Civil War. We talk today that President Bush has 35% approval rating. We have legislation pending in Congress to cut off this war. It's nothing compared to the summer of 1864, when after the year had passed, Gettysburg and Vicksburg were a distant memory, and everybody had thought instead Wilderness and Cold Harbor was the future. And the worry was not that Lincoln would not be reelected, but he wouldn't even be nominated for the Republican nomination until General Sherman took Atlanta. Harry Truman left office with 22% approval rating. And what gave the communists a reprieve was not necessarily the Chinese army, which after a year in Korea had suffered 700,000 casualties from B-29 and artillery attacks, but a divided public at home. It didn't think that the entire peninsula was worth further investment in blood and treasure by the United States. That's always been true. Thucydides has a great analysis of that, although I disagree ultimately with his verdict in Book 7, when he said the Sicilian expedition failed because people at home did not support it. I think they supported a lot, but nevertheless his point is that unless the Athenians were consistently willing to sacrifice, that expedition would not succeed. So you can call off conventional superiority by redefining losses in an asymmetrical fashion, by dividing the West in an internecine fashion, and by hoping that a consensual society might not agree to further invest in a war. There's one final one, and it's the most common to you all, and that's what I would call military parasitism. I mentioned that just a second, that given the nature of weapons and weapons development, a person, a nation, a tribe can borrow or be sold Western weapons, and because they're often designed for mass production, learn how to use them very easily. Now that means that Native Americans can have 30-30 sold to them, and although they might not have avenues for their repair, and they surely won't be always up to date with the latest model, they will be good enough to give them parity on the battlefield for a period. And this has always plagued Western armies. If we were to go look at the arsenal at Venice and see that marvelous ship-making factory that could, when asked, turn out a galley in about 2 days, and look how the Ottomans copied it at the Topkapi Peninsula in Istanbul, in some ways there's no comparison. The Ottomans used green lumber. They didn't have the exact level of craftsmanship. Their cannon were not metallurgically pure. But nevertheless, they copied it enough that they could turn out a galley to the naked eye, look close enough, and with greater numbers and greater support, they could find parity on the battlefield. And so it seems to me that throughout the West, where the Romans are fighting Germans that have scuta, or the gladius, or whether Greeks themselves find Thracians that have imported plate armor, or whether it's gunpowder that's sold to Zulus, and they can find from the Portuguese in Mozambique weapons that are almost as good as the British. Westerners can often find that whatever advantage they have as the creators of weapons, that there's a near parity. Now I say near because obviously weapons development and evolution will be faster among the people who created the weapons in the first place. But, and this is a but, doesn't mean that Mr. Ahmadinejad won't get a nuclear weapon, and given the nature of nuclear weapons, if it functions along the levels of a 1950s American bomb, that'll be good enough. Something to keep in mind. Where does all this lead us to? At the end of history, so to speak, in the 21st century. It seems to me that I'm not one that believes that technology changes the rules. After all, water retains its essence no matter how you deliver it. I have a pump on my farm, and my grandfather had a well there, and the same pump, different pump, excuse me, same well, and he could get about 100 gallons a minute in a very primitive gasoline pump in the 1920s. I can flip on the switch and get 1,500 gallons a minute, but the water is still the same. In other words, military thought and practice remains immune through the ages because it's entirely a human phenomenon. The human mind, despite suggestions that we're changing or evolving at a very rapid rate, has not changed. Human nature is constant. Therefore, war itself has laws that are immutable and can be studied across time and space. But the delivery system does. And what that means is you have to be aware that these laws and these realities, there is no longer a window of laxity. Things change very quickly. In at least two ways, it seems to me that the West is in deep peril. One is that, as I said, in a globalized world where information on the internet is accessible to anybody and profit can be made and not be traced, and Western modes of finance, capital, banking, investment are now uniform throughout the globe, it seems to me that it's going to be very hard for the West to maintain any monopoly on weapons whatsoever, and that its most deadly weapons can be in the hands of terrorists or people who want to destroy Western countries very easily. I was in Libya a year ago, and a member of the Libyan government came to me and said, "I don't understand you Americans. You invaded Iraq to stop WMD. You paid a terrible price. There was no WMD there. But we had a lot more than they did, and we gave it up." And then he started to explain to me all the things they had. Anthrax, smallpox. This is in Libya. When one notices when you go to Libya that although it exports 1.5 million barrels of oil per day, it can't use that derivative to make asphalt to patch the potholes from the airport to the downtown. And yet it had sophisticated biological weapons that now we are spending $100 million to incinerate. So that seems to me that it's going to make it very hard for Western leaders to make these decisions quickly, and they cannot count on weapons being a little bit worse or not quite evolving. They're going to be almost equal instantaneously. One last anecdote. I talked to a member of the Israeli Defense Forces, and he said that one of the problems they had when they went into southern Lebanon this summer was that they found people, 19, 20, with Levi's and T-shirts, but the body armor that they had on, the computer jamming devices, some of the communications equipment, was FedExed into Beirut, bought on international arms catalogs through Iranian petrol money, and they had actually more money at their disposal than the IDF did. And when you add to it sophisticated Russian anti-tank weapons that were sold on the open market, you can see what I'm getting at. The second is, and finally, it seems to me that although Western armies have always been subject to consensuality and criticism at home, there was always some time of lag time. Lag time. We don't really know the details day by day when Sherman was outside Atlanta, but we do know when he said Atlanta is ours and fairly won, that it caused euphoria. But we don't know what the effect would have been had the Union public been apprised minute by minute about what Nathan Bedford Forrest was doing to his supply lines for that whole campaign. We do know, and I'm talking about an age now of electronic communications even in the 19th century, we do know that the American public was euphoric after the news came that they had invaded Normandy, European continent, lost less than 3,500 dead. We don't know what the result would be if the American public had been told weeks prior we lost 800 dead in a trial run up in England trying to master amphibious operations. Or we do know that the B-29s destroyed the industrial sector of Japan and dropped the bombs. We don't know what would have happened had the American public known instantaneously the sad history of mistakes, death, and failure of that bomber all through 1943 and 1944. So people really didn't think it would work. One of the most chilling things growing up was my father had a book of B-29s where he flew on them, and they had nice names like Thumper and Dumbo, and I'd say, "What happened to Thumper?" And he said, "Well, they had the old Allison engines. They took off Tinian, and they just went straight down and blew up, 11 men." And he would put a little X on each one. In this book of planes, they were all X'd out. 16 planes in the squadron, 14 of them were destroyed through mechanical error. And we didn't hear that part. We only heard of their successes. So it seems to me that in a postmodern society such as our own, where we've reached a level of affluence and leisure never seen before in the history of civilization, and with globalized communications, it's going to be increasingly more difficult for a Western public to approve military operations, because they will think that they're not perfect, and if they're not perfect, they won't be good, and they'll come to a cessation. That offers hope if the military operation is ill-founded in the long tradition of Western consent and civilian control of the military, but it bodes ill if the military operation was necessary but plagued by routine and commonplace setbacks before the eventual victory. So it's something to think about. Thank you very much. I'll be happy to take any questions.